Okay, everyone, let's get going. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to episode 49 of This Week is Live. So glad to see you well. I'm your host, Raymond Flotat from mxdwn.com. We've got a ton of ground to cover, and we are now officially, as you've heard me mentioning in previous installments of this show, at our penultimate episode of what we're loosely going to call season one. Not really exactly a season show, but this is going to be a break after next week's episode into 2024. So we're going to take a pause for a couple months, and there's going to be a whole bunch more video content coming in different varieties and different forms through Mixdown. And then ultimately, we're going to shift and come back with what we'll loosely call a season two, bringing you stories and headlines and interviews and all kinds of special guests and all kinds of crazy crap that's going to happen in 2024. But first, let's start right away because we've got a whole bunch of stories to cover and not a ton of time. So let's get into it. First and foremost, the 2024 Grammy nominees have been announced, and it's a bevy of different artists across every different mold of what you consider music. Now, the Grammys to a lot of people are generally a edifice that people try to ignore. I mean, unless you're a music industry person, most people I ever talk to, even really big music fans, just do not care about the Grammys. They are not interested in seeing what happens on the Grammys. They're not interested in who wins. And part of this reputation might be well earned by the fact that usually when the Grammys take place, the winner of the big awards almost always has seemed to have gone through to a Heritage Act, someone who probably should have gotten it 20, 30, 40 years earlier. And maybe that had something to do with the median age of the Grammy voting committee and the people who had earned Grammys over a lifetime. Maybe it had something to do with their leadership. There was a whole bunch of controversies revolving around their leader, Neil Portnow, who's no longer in charge of the Grammys. This year, things seem to be a bit front loaded towards what is ultimately going to be a much more modern crop of nominees. And we'll talk about that in a second here. Interestingly, SZA, who we've always liked here at Mixdown, has the most nominees this year with 9, and followed shortly thereafter it, and no, I'm not kidding, by Phoebe Bridgers. Now, this is a little bit dubious too, because of course, some of that is for her band with, Julian Baker and Lucy Dacus, Boy Genius. So some of those nominations that she has comes from, Boy Genius nominations. But right now, SZA and Phoebe Bridgers are the leading Grammy nominations for this year's installment. And that's saying something, because it usually doesn't work out to be something like that, where there are two artists who people legitimately like. That's a good thing. And whatever you may feel about SZA or Phoebe Bridgers' music, that's a good thing, because it's at least representative of what something is that's actually going on right now. For those of you keeping score, the big award, which is almost always album of the year, which, in this era, it's how much album of the year means is definitely a bit different than it was 10, 20 years ago, where that was, of course, the award to win if you were going to win an award. Harry Styles won it in 2022. We were at the top of this year when the awards were given out for the 2023 Grammys. Harry Styles won it for last year. So does that feel like your year? I don't know. Harry Styles has a lot of fans when you look back on it and all the different other people who were nominated last year. Does Harry Styles feel like what it is? Interesting. Okay. Well, big awards for this year. Album of the year we'll talk about first. The nominees are Boy Genius, Janelle Monáe, Lana Del Rey, Miley Cyrus, Olivia Rodrigo, SZA, Taylor Swift, who's clearly winning everything in every capacity as far as what a musician can be. And interestingly, previous winner, Jon Batiste, who won 2 years ago. Now, if I were a betting man, Jon Batiste is the one curious inclusion in this category. Not because he's not great, he is great, but because when it comes to the Grammys, there's a weird tendency to have all these fan favorites. And if you have that many nominees in a critical category, there could be a measure of vote splitting. You might see Jon Batiste walk away with it. Not necessarily what I would choose, but it wouldn't be surprising if that happened. If it's not going to be Jon Batiste, it would probably be between Boy Genius and Olivia Rodrigo, as far as I'm concerned. Elsewhere, record of the year, Billie Eilish, Boy Genius, Jon Batiste again, Miley Cyrus, Olivia Rodrigo for Vampire, SZA for Kill Bill, Taylor Swift for Antihero, and Victoria Monet for Oh My Mama. And then elsewhere, Song of the Year is nominating Billie Eilish, Dua Lipa, Jon Batiste again for Butterfly, Lana Del Rey for A&W, Miley Cyrus for Flowers, which is a really good song. If you haven't heard it, that's a great song. SZA again for Kill Bill, and Taylor Swift for Antihero. Now, the other categories, I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just talk about a couple of the critical ones right now that are significant. Best New Artist has Coco Jones, Gracie Abrams, Fred Again, who was one of the late replacements for Coachella headliner, along with Skrillex after the whole Frank Ocean debacle that happened. We talked about that a lot earlier in the show. Jelly Roll, Noah Khan, Victoria Monet, and The War and Treaty. Elsewhere, just an interesting side note, because you're not the kind of person you'd ever expect to see nominated for a Grammy. Aphex Twin is one of the nominees, were Best Dance Electronic Recording, along with Disclosure, Romy, and Fred Again, Skrillex and Fred Again, and James Blake. Not sure I would put James Blake in that bucket. Okay, sure, fine. That's fine. Best rock performance, for those of you keeping score, has Arctic Monkeys, Black Pumas, Foo Fighters, and Metallica. Foo Fighters a little bit, Metallica a little bit more of a metal band, but sure, they can be under rock performance. But interestingly, Boy Genius in this category. So Boy Genius being considered a rock nominee. In the past, K-Flay has been nominated for Best Rock Song, and I don't know if I ever thought of K-Flay as rock, but that's fine. Best Metal Performance, Disturbed, Ghost, Metallica, Slipknot, and who I would bet you will win, just because of the way the wind's blowing, Spirit Box. Best Rock Song also has Boy Genius and Foo Fighters, but then, interestingly, Olivia Rodrigo, Queens of the Stone Age, and the Rolling Stones. So there's a mishmash, and, just given the relative popularity and celebrity of Olivia Rodrigo, I wouldn't be surprised if she walks away with that category, even though probably not a rock song. Best Rock Album has Greta Van Fleet, who is also, just like Ghost, going through their kind of heir apparent moment, along with Foo Fighters, Metallica, Paramore. Okay, interesting. Not. I would have thought Paramore maybe a little bit more alternative, but sure, that could be under rock. And then Queens of the Stone Age with their album In Times New Roman. Best Alternative Music Performance, which has been a lot of different things over the years. Originally a category created in the heyday of grunge and alternative music in the 90s, and different kinds of artists of different stature have usually been lumped in there. So, we've seen a lot of Boy Genius stuff showing up in rock categories. Well, Boy Genius is also under Best Alternative Music Performance. Okay, sure. Well, along with Always, Arctic Monkeys, Lana Del Rey, and Paramore. Interesting one. Best Alternative Music Album has Arctic Monkeys, Boy Genius, Gorillaz, sole nomination as far as I can tell, Grecker Island, Lana Del Rey for Did You Know That There's a Tunnel Under Ocean Boulevard? Still a funny album name if I ever heard one. And then PJ Harvey, I Inside, The Old Year Dying. Long probably overdue, because PJ Harvey's been brilliant for literally an eternity and not really recognized by committees like this. PJ Harvey's been doing incredible music since the very early 90s. If you don't know PJ Harvey, you should listen to PJ Harvey. Best Rap Performance, and this is the last one I'm going to go on to before we go into more stories and more headlines, includes Baby Keem featuring Kendrick Lamar, The Hillbillies, which they just headlined at Camp Flog Gnaw the other weekend. Black Thought, which was a fantastic record. We loved it all over here at Mixdown. Coi Leray, Drake and 21 Savage, and Killer Mike featuring Andre 3000, Future, and Aaron Allen Kane, scientists and engineers. So we'll be there, even though probably most of you won't. We will be covering this in a lot of detail when it comes around in February, and that will ultimately be a giant batch of news. This is an important thing for people who are performers and trying to make a career in music. Say what you will if you're not a fan of the show or wanting to watch the 4 hours of sometimes startling disappointment that it tends to be. It is important. If people win in the right categories, it can help slingshot their career. It can make a lot of things happen. And, for me in general, I've always kind of wanted to watch it, hoping the right people win in the right categories, hoping the right players win. It doesn't always work out that way. But ultimately, sometimes it's fun enough just to watch in terms of seeing the performances and the collaborations that happen. Hopefully this year, it'll be a little bit more representative of what's going on in music and a little bit more fun to watch. Now, we cover a lot of festivals at Mixdown, and you'll probably notice by watching this show that we don't always talk about the festival lineups on this show. Sometimes there's really incredible lineups, or things like Sick New World, where both years of Sick New World sold out in literally a couple hours each time, last year and this year's announcement for the coming year's festival in April. We don't always talk about every lineup. We'll talk about Coachella, maybe we'll talk about Bonnaroo, but we won't talk about every single festival that's happening. It's just too much. There's now to the point where even in my home state of Connecticut, there is major music festivals. So there really isn't time to go into every single roster of every festival. Now, this one has a little bit of an interesting kind of curveball in it, which is this is the festival that's been known as Rolling Loud. It's a hip hop festival. In this particular instance of the festival, it was a festival that is going to happen at Hollywood Park in Inglewood, which is just south of Los Angeles. It's by SoFi Stadium. It's in this whole area where there's the YouTube complex and just way too many giant venues, and is, of course, kind of bottlenecking traffic all over the city in Los Angeles. But this bill was announced, including a whole mess of different top-notch hip-hop talent. Nicki Minaj, and Ray Sremmurd and Post Malone and Big Sean and Chief Keef and all these other people. Really, just all over the place, lots of hip hop talent, and Rolling Loud has been doing that for quite some time. Well, they went out initially announcing Lil Uzi Vert being the headliner for Sunday. And that's interesting, more so than anything, because not long after the announcement came out, this is kind of an oops moment. Lil Uzi Vert went on his own Instagram and said, and I quote, "I never said I was doing Rolling Loud. Don't understand why my name is on here." So something got lost in communication. Maybe they were in negotiations with his agent. Maybe there was a discussion about him playing the bill, and ultimately it didn't come through, or maybe the ink wasn't dry and they had to kind of adjust on the fly. And now they've gone through and they've announced that replacing Lil Uzi Vert as a Sunday headliner is going to be a special collaborative set from the rapper Future and the producer who's become very famous in the last few years, Metro Boomin. If you're not familiar with that name, and part of many, many different careers in modern hip hop right now, but also recently was a part of curating, executive producing the soundtrack for the phenomenally successful Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, the next cartoon, the second movie, and what is the Miles Morales Spider-Man that's so popular. If you don't know, ask the youngest person you know who's maybe 10, 12 years old, and they'll give you an earful about how important Miles Morales is. Then, not to be outdone, the other big award show nomination, which is quickly becoming kind of the new Oscars in its own field, in its own medium, is the Game Awards. Now, the Game Awards are a invention of a kind of pundit and personality named Jeff Keighley. Jeff Keighley was a part of Tech TV and G4 TV way back in the day when that was a big thing, maybe 15, 18 years ago, has always been a person working really hard to celebrate video game culture and the best of video games, and has just kind of been one of those few really famous kind of talking heads in the arena of video games. He's held the flag high for his medium when I don't think many people credibly have tried to. And he was a part of this thing called Coliseum at, E3 that used to happen. There was some kind of contract fallout there. He stopped doing that. And then he's a big part of an event that has now happened. And that while they would not tell you it's taking the place of E3, which E3 obviously didn't happen this year, which is called Summer Game Fest. But in my opinion, it probably will, because it happens right around the same time E3 would have. And if E3's not there, this is the new E3, in my opinion. That's not their opinion, that's my opinion. But ultimately, one of the really brilliant things that Jeff Keighley spearheaded, and this started a decade ago, was an event called the Game Awards. Now, there wasn't really, prior to this, a major show that focused on the best and brightest, what was happening in the world of video games. And now this has become kind of the pulse of their year, whereas, it used to be E3 was the big thing in June, and that was where most things got announced. The Game Awards, which are live streamed for free all over the world and hundreds of millions of people end up watching it across the planet. The Game Awards happening in December, on December 10th, this being their 10th anniversary, as I mentioned, is kind of like a combination between an award show and trailer theater. Now, if you're not a big fan of video games, this might be like, huh? But in the world of video games, gamers love to see releases of new footage and gameplay from games that they love. There's nothing that they like more. And it really just makes sense. This is not the kind of environment where they're looking for long acceptance speeches or really big pompous performances. The Game Awards, to be fair, has often included performances. Green Day played one year. There was a really wonderful performance by Daniel Lanois and Rhiannon Giddens coming off the heels of Red Dead Redemption 2. So there are sometimes musical performances, but it's not really about that. People watch the Game Awards both to see who wins, but also to see what is going to be unveiled there. Elden Ring, which is one of the big successes of the last 2 years in video games, was widely promoted there on the Game Awards and was voted numerous times most anticipated game. And it is generally just a really good show. If you care at all about that medium, if you care at all about video games, it is a really fantastic show for that. Now, the big nominees in this year's batch of nominees, we're not going to go through all the categories again, probably a lot less categories than we went through for the Grammys, but are, not surprisingly, if you follow the realm of video games, Alan Wake 2 and Baldur's Gate 3. Alan Wake 2 is the sequel to the very popular, going way, way, way back, 10, 15 years, original Alan Wake, which is kind of its own sci-fi kind of horror kind of mystery thing. And this is the really wonderful and super nail-biting and intense sequel. There was an interview that we did that we aired on this show about a month or two back, coming off of Summer Game Fest, and you can read our review. We'll put that link in the description. And it is, when this is ultimately up on YouTube next week, but, disturbing but incredible game. And then Baldur's Gate 3 was kind of the come from behind, come out of nowhere, massive juggernaut success of the summer for video games, being steeped incredibly heavily in Dungeons and Dragons culture and having all kinds of really crazy, memeified kind of content, and that all the characters can potentially romance other characters. There's this thing, I'm not going to get into it too deep, but about how apparently you can even induce a romance to someone wild shaped into a bear. I'm not going to go any further than that on this show, but look it up. It's out there. And ultimately, the Game Awards have been led with these two games having 8 nominations apiece in what was just announced the other day. Now, one of the things that I've not been wild about is they used to have a best male and best female performance in an incredibly, progressive time. They've kind of consolidated that down into just best performance. Not that I have any kind of problem with that as far as, not trying to distinguish and just saying best performance overall. But then my complaint with that kind of consolidation and not having those different categories, this means like 5 or 6 less people get nominated. And if you're a voice actor or a motion caption performer for a video game, it probably means a lot to even be nominated for something like that at the Game Awards. But this year, Ben Starr for Final Fantasy 16, Cameron Monaghan for Jedi Survivor, Idris Elba for Cyberpunk 2077, Phantom Liberty, Melanie Liburd for Alan Wake 2, Neil Newbon for Baldur's Gate 3, and Yuri Lowenthal for Marvel's Spider-Man 2. Now, one of the things I'll point out about the Game Awards, and they have the category, which thank God that they do. It's really smart, and every award show should have something similar to this. Best Indie Game. Now, I will be the first to admit, I'm not super familiar with these games that are mentioned here. Cocoon, Dave the Diver, Dredge, Sea of Stars, and Viewfinder. One of the reasons I mention this is that in previous years, the games that are ultimately surfaced as nominees for Best Indie Game at the Game Awards often tend to be pretty damn good. So it's definitely worth looking into if you're not familiar. Elsewhere in the Best Action Adventure Game category, there is what you'd expect: Alan Wake 2, Resident Evil 4, Jedi Survivor, Legend of Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom. But then, of course, one of the other big juggernaut successes of the year, Marvel's Spider-Man 2. Not to be confused with the movies, this is the video game Spider-Man 2. There is Best Fighting Game, including Mortal Kombat 1 and Street Fighter 6. But then the big category, Game of the Year, analogous to Album of the Year from the Grammys, features Alan Wake 2, Baldur's Gate 3, Marvel Spider-Man 2, Resident Evil 4, Super Mario Bros. Wonder, and another giant big hit from this year, The Legend of Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom. I asked our games editor, Zach Dalton, who you've seen some little bits and vignettes in our socials coming off Summer Game Fest, who did he think was going to win? And he seemed to think it would be Tears of the Kingdom. So that's his prediction. We'll see what comes of that. In the world of television, something I just wanted to spotlight briefly because I just generally think it's really cool and it doesn't get as much attention as so many other things that are happening in the arenas of movies and television. What If Season 2 is coming, and it's coming December 22nd. Now, if you're not familiar with this, What If was a very famous comic book series that Marvel did where they basically just messed with their own continuity. They would throw storylines in the garbage and they would basically present it as alternate dimensions and, well, what if this happened instead of what actually happened? And then they would tell an interesting story around how that would be different if things had gone that different way. Marvel, and their juggernaut success, not this year, but coming back 3-4 years ago, and of course, a big mad rush to push out as much content in Disney Plus as possible, that being one of the big pieces of agenda for Disney as a corporation at that point. Marvel had announced that Jeffrey Wright would voice the Watcher, Uatu, and that they would do a whole season of an animated show featuring many of the major stars from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They didn't get all of them. There are people like Dave Bautista and Scarlett Johansson and Robert Downey Jr. who didn't reprise their roles, but many of the other principal actors from that show, from their movies and shows, like Elizabeth Olsen or Michael B. Jordan or Toby Jones, who played Arnim Zola, or Chris Hemsworth even, who played Thor, or Benedict Cumberbatch, who played Doctor Strange, reprised their character voices for the show. And in the end, if you haven't seen it, it was really damn good. It was surprisingly good, had a really interesting and kind of flashy animation style. It was a really well done and executed animated show. And it did borrow heavily and lean on the movies that everybody knows and everybody likes, and then really mess with the continuity in terms of everything that happened. But it was in keeping with what a lot of Marvel Studios does. It was a story that wrapped all the way around until the very end. The finale of it, how the show wrapped up, everything that you learned every episode fed into this big, huge story that had to do with Ultron, which was not voiced by James Spader, but Ross Marquand, if you're a fan of The Walking Dead. And it was really, really wonderful. So they're coming back with season 2. And what's interesting and different about this one, and I have no idea why. Maybe they're desperate to keep people watching Disney Plus for the holidays. But instead of it coming out over 9 weeks, like season one did, it's going to come out over 9 days starting on December 22nd. So basically, I guess 9 days of Christmas, as our television editor Lauren indicated to me just the other day, that this is some different kind of approach. So apparently, every day starting December 22nd, that there was going to be, one new episode every day. Some of the same people that were there in the first season that are known from the movies are going to be there, but then also some of the, like Haley Atwell, and then also who played Black Widow in it, Lake Bell will be reprising her character, and then Josh Keaton, who did Captain America. So I'll be watching. It's something, if you haven't seen it, and if you have any tolerance for comic book movies or animation, it's absolutely worth watching. It's a really, really good show. The Smile. This comes from our team in Mixdown UK across the pond. Now, The Smile, if you're not familiar, is a satellite band, if you will, a side project featuring Tom York and Johnny Greenwood, along with drummer Tom Skinner from Radiohead. Obviously, Tom York and Johnny Greenwood from Radiohead, not Tom Skinner. But anyway, point being, this is kind of a side project, as it were. And I bring this up mostly, we don't talk about a lot of album announcement news on this show, because how many albums would we be talking about? I could spend an hour and a half just reading off album announcement dates on this show. It isn't necessarily as newsworthy, but I bring this up because The Smile is a really good band. I had the good fortune of going to see them last December, and it was a crowded house. I mean, packed to the walls. I'm sure based on the fame of Radiohead, and of course quite a lot of people hoping for a Radiohead song, and not a Radiohead song was to be played. So a good lesson for you if you're a fan of The Smile, probably not to expect that. But their first album, which came out in May of 2022, was called A Light for Attracting. They have a new album they just announced. It's coming out January 26th. It's called Wall of Eyes. And one of the things I will point out, one of the last songs they played when I did see them last December was called Bending Hectic. And that is on this album. They announced it at the time as being a relatively new song. It is super, super fire. If you're a fan of, wow, I don't even know what. Like, if you're a big Radiohead dork, that song is nuts. They released it as a single a few months ago. But I bring this up also just because I think it's worth mentioning. Not Radiohead. Radiohead not really up to anything. And, there's not really much in terms of reporting. The three members of the group don't really give interviews behind the project. They're not really talking about, inspirations for it or what's going on with Radiohead. But what's interesting to me is we're not seeing new Radiohead material, and it's been some years now since we have. There's been some cryptic statements in the press from some of the other members that they don't really know what's going on with the band. When I listen to The Smile, and they're great, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Tom York and Johnny Greenwood are objectively geniuses when it comes to making music. It sounds like songs that probably they couldn't hash out with Radiohead. I'm just speculating. I don't have anything in terms of reporting to offer there. That's just me editorializing. But, when I hear it, those sound like songs that probably were written for Radiohead, and Radiohead didn't end up doing them. But at any rate, still a really fascinating and good band. A quick note coming out of YouTube and AI content. We've had tons of stories about artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence is certainly becoming the topic du jour worldwide. It was a big part of what fueled the strikes with WGA and SAG-AFTRA with the TV and motion picture industries. And it's an alarming thing that, it's complicated, and the ability for it to be a disrupting force in the way we've done things, are also a fascinating way to simplify things. It's a complicated issue. Well, one of the things that is obviously a concern for the music industry is there's a certain degree of inherent copyright and likeness and trademark that quite a fortune was spent creating, making, releasing, distributing, marketing. And now it's become incredibly easy for AI software to learn the likeness of a particular person, singer, guitar player, what have you, and then for artificial intelligence to just remix and repurpose that without permission. You can just do that. It's readily available now. If you haven't heard some of the silly things like a Red Hot Chili Peppers song with completely gobbledygook lyrics, or Snoop Dogg, doing a song that he would never ever do. It's out there. It's been out there for over a year now. Well, YouTube is going to be evolving things where in the coming months, as they say, platform users will have to fulfill a requirement to disclose whether or not the content that they're creating or putting on YouTube is created in any part by AI. And then if it does, it's going to be labeled as such that it was using AI to create it. The other reason that we bring this up is because they apparently have a need that they want to promote realistic content, things made by real people. And, when you're industrious, if you don't know technology, if you're the kind of person who's really good at technology and there's this kind of capability to do things, I mean, you can make a whole Frank Zappa level catalog with a handful of button pushes automated without ever having to compose and create things. It's certainly very disruptive, as I mentioned before. But within this, they're also going to be giving the ability for music partners, that means record labels, maybe content creators too, to some extent, the bands, the artists, the songwriters, but they're going to be giving them, quote, we're also introducing the ability for our music partners to request the removal of AI generated music content that mimics an artist's unique singing or rapping voice. In addition, in determining whether to grant a removal request, we'll consider factors such as whether content is the subject of news reporting, analysis, or critique of the synthetic vocals. So things are certainly adjusting on the fly daily as things are going on. There was, to shift gears to the arena of movies for a moment, a Star Wars movie that was going to be executive produced by Kevin Feige. If you're a fan of comic book movies, or if you're at all a person who pays attention to the movie business, it's been kind of hard not to know Kevin Feige's name. Kevin Feige is the mastermind at Marvel Studios, who's been behind all of the Marvel Studios content, and of course, to some extent, the Disney Plus related content that's been happening the last few years since WandaVision and Falcon and the Winter Soldier. And he's largely been the guy credited with making sure the overall barometer of quality was there. Kevin Feige is famous to the movie industry right now as having, the largest string of massively successful movies in a continuity basically ever, and has long proclaimed himself a big fan of the original Star Wars movies and Indiana Jones movies, and there had been long talked about that would have featured Michael Waldron to write the script, a Star Wars movie that he would have been kind of executive producing. And there was an interview with him recently and Entertainment Tonight apparently, and someone asked him if the Star Wars movie executive producing was still happening, and he had only one word to say in response: no. No other details for you to report there. But as some commentary, we talked a lot on the show about how Marvel Studios, and then last week, most significantly, The Marvels, which wasn't a bad movie, but The Marvels straight up tanked at the box office and did only $47 million, which is the lowest opening of any Marvel Studios movie in the history of the studio, going all the way back since Iron Man 1, less than even the original Incredible Hulk starring Edward Norton. And Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania wasn't good. Maybe some of the Disney Plus shows weren't so good. Not everybody liked Thor: Love and Thunder. The Eternals was terrible. So who knows why, but I would speculate maybe this has something to do with about refocusing on making sure the Marvel movies are good. But that's just, once again, pure speculation on my part. And then, lastly, just because this is kind of the first shot I would call as far as what's going to be several months of really interesting and kind of exciting news, because, of course, movies and television and the arenas of movie and television have been totally gridlocked behind the WGA and SAG-AFTRA strikes. Talent wasn't allowed to promote anything. Studios couldn't use the talent to promote anything. So there wasn't any efforts to really announce new things or talk about things. Productions were being halted left, right, and center. Some shows have been canceled in the aftermath of this. So everything's kind of been just brakes, firmly pumped. Nothing happening. Nothing can happen. Well, strikes are theoretically over. The union membership from SAG-AFTRA has not ratified it yet. That vote is still kind of in the works in terms of them officially ratifying it, but gears are turning again. Shows are starting to announce that they're going to be filmed. Movies are being announced of what they're going to happen, what's going to go on. Casting news has happened. And here's that first sign that you're about to get a deluge of information, as I'm sure on some level, some of this stuff was happening quietly and just couldn't be announced. And on some level, maybe it's just really actually happening now that people know that they can film things or do things or write things or produce things. And recent It Boy, Pedro Pascal, some of you may know as playing Oberyn Martell from Game of Thrones several years back, and then more famously recently being the star and of the breakout hit shows The Mandalorian and The Last of Us. And he's a great actor and a great personality, and he's really, really popular right now. Well, apparently, according to The Hollywood Reporter and according to a Patreon user named Daniel Reichman, is being considered to play Reed Richards in what is going to be the long-awaited, since Disney and Marvel bought Fox as entertainment properties, Fantastic Four movie, which there has been several attempts at over the years, and all of them terrible. And this might be the first time that anybody gets to see the Fantastic Four adapted into a movie that might actually be really good. And so people have been waiting for news about that and the X-Men ever since. And it hasn't really happened, and this is the first word that apparently it is. The ink is not dry in the agreement, but apparently Marvel is looking strongly at Pedro Pascal to play that part. For those of you that are keeping score, there was a recent Doctor Strange sequel that came out last year, which was Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, and there was kind of an alternate universe kind of nod to the Fantastic Four, and John Krasinski, who has been in Hollywood in numerous capacities and in The Office and other things like that, kind of played a version of Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic from the Fantastic Four, but it was kind of long discussed as this was just kind of most likely all that it was, kind of a nod to fan casting. Fans have been saying maybe John Krasinski would end up playing that part for a long time. So fingers crossed. Pedro Pascal would be a great choice, even though he wasn't super great in Wonder Woman in 1984. Now, to end off this week, I thought we would tell a music-centric story and talk about something directly related to the arena of music. And kind of coincidentally, I suppose, because, just me in my own life, I've been consciously trying to get more sleep. Sleep is not a thing that I've ever done much of. It's just not easy for me. I don't get tired easily. You hear about there being like two different kinds of people when it comes to sleep. Some people have to sleep every day, and if they don't get enough sleep, they're just not right by themselves. And then certain other people don't sleep that much, and then ultimately, when it comes time after several days of not really sleeping, they sleep a ton, and then they catch up on their sleep, and then they catch up on their rest. That's always kind of been me. I don't know why. It's just not a thing. I just don't really get tired as much. But for whatever reason, in many, many years of hard work, it was a decision like, hey, let's sleep more. And then I found myself wearing a Sleep t-shirt today. And that got me thinking about the band Sleep. Many of you out there probably don't know this band. If you're not really entrenched in heavy music circles, you might not be familiar with the band Sleep, which has mostly been fronted by Matt Pike, Al Cisneros, and Jason Reeder. Different people have played drums over the years. But it is a pretty wonderful little pocket of a sub-genre. And this is one of those moments where we'll get to talk about a subgenre, right? We often talk about different genres of music. Things tend to be decently monochromatically what they are. It's a pop thing. It's a singer-songwriter thing. It's a hip-hop thing. It's an EDM thing. It's a experimental noise thing. Well, in many genres, most genres, there's little splinter factions of genres. So, for example, in the arena of alt country, did you know that there is a tweener genre of alt country that is called lo-fi, which is kind of somewhere between Americana alt country and a very dirty kind of punk rock, very, gritty production and, very lo-fi sounding, hence the name. Well, in the arena of heavy metal, there is a subgenre commonly referred to as stoner rock or stoner metal, usually marked by fans' interest in listening to the music while smoking marijuana or weed, or that the music itself is usually more elongated. It's not quite like most heavy metal. Most people think of heavy metal and they think of thundering drums and they think of a lot of intensity and dry lung roar vocals. But stoner rock, which is largely credited as having originated from the Melvins, coming in their time as one of the original grunge bands, a few years after being kind of the progenitor of that genre, then they shifted and they had a slower, much more deliberate sound where they were just in no rush to get to the hook. They were in no rush to get to a chorus. They could let long, drawn out chords just ring for minutes and minutes and minutes. And, if you want to hear something truly, truly fascinating, one of my favorite records basically ever made is the album that is now known as just self-titled, but was originally the Melvins album called Lysol, which is more or less 131 long minute song. And it may sound daunting. I know a lot of you out there are like, oh God, I can't get anywhere near something like that. It's gorgeous. It's incredible. And it's basically the album equivalent of a parabolic arc. Well, the effort that the Melvins undertook in that spawned numerous other bands that started to push further and further and further in that arena. And one of the earliest of them was Sleep. Now, Sleep came to it, and they did an album in the early 90s that came out in late 1992, early 1993, which is commonly referred to as Holy Mountain. And it became famous as one of the best albums of this subgenre, this microgenre, as it were. For many years, the band wasn't active. Matt Pike went on to be a part of a band, still is, called High on Fire. It's also a very good band, but a lot more kind of like aggressive and, a lot more driving of a band than Sleep tends to be. And then there was kind of a big resurgence because people had continually kept loving more and more and more Holy Mountain. They did follow this up, by the way, years later with an album called Jerusalem that was then later repackaged and then renamed, which is interesting, a little bit longer and a little bit different because they refer to it apparently internally by different names, which is more or less a one song album. It was originally called Jerusalem, but then as I came to know it through the label TP Records, which was a great record label we worked with a lot in the early days of Mixdown, as Dope Smoker. Not surprisingly, by the whole Stoner Rock affiliation. Dope Smoker is a fantastic record for something that is 55 some odd minutes long and just one unending song. It is thrilling in a really bizarre way. And the big part of what makes Stoner Rock special is that it is very deliberate, very methodical, and they are working towards something in a group, in a vibe, in a pocket. They're not really just rushing to a hook. It certainly requires a certain degree of patience. And if you're not kind of a person who digs those sounds, it might be a little bit more challenging. But at the same time, if you can get through that, if you can, be there for that, so gratifying, so exciting, and so interesting. Well, winding the clock back to Holy Mountain, I was lucky enough just once, this was way back in 2010, to see Sleep do this album in its entirety. I've seen Sleep numerous times since. They've reunited a few different times, and like I say, sometimes with different drummers. But I've been able to see them multiple times otherwise, and they haven't really done this just like this. But when they were together in 2010, 2009, they were doing the entirety of Holy Mountain all in sequence. And the interesting kind of side note about it was I saw it at one of the worst music festivals I've ever been to. So years back, there was a festival here in Los Angeles, and it was put on by a concert promoter of the same name, and it was called FYF Fest. Now, this literally goes back to its origins, which was originally that it was called Fuck Yeah Fest. And then Fuck Yeah Fest became FYF, but then FYF became FYF Fest. So it was literally Fuck Yeah Fest. Sure. Well, in 2010, as they were starting to grow and starting to become kind of the new it thing, and larger crowds were coming to these events because they booked a lot of smaller shows all around Los Angeles, playing stuff that was kind of in the noise rock, punk rock kind of vein. They announced a bill, which was, at the time, they were a really big band at the time, being one of Pitchfork's early darlings in their era of success, The Rapture, but also including Panda Bear, who was kind of breaking out from Animal Collective at the time. Dead Man's Bones, a band that history will record was a briefly done project that featured none other than Ryan Gosling. I missed this band at this show, just for the record. Man, who's always been wonderful, the legendary punk band 7 Seconds, and Ted Leo and the Pharmacist, and then also, who were new at the time, Ariel Pink's Haunted Graffiti. Well, this particular festival was something of a nightmare. And, Sleep was one of the things that was happening that was one of the big draws for me. And they were, of course, doing Holy Mountain in its entirety. And they were, along with Panda Bear and The Rapture, basically one of the few headliners on the day. This was one day happening at the LA Historic State Park down in downtown. And this is kind of a big park that usually people just walk around and walk their dogs in. And they had rented it for FYF Fest. Well, whatever the case may be, this was a festival of like juggernaut problems, because when you go to festivals, what is the things that sucks about festivals? Parking, lines, cost of food, services, too many people. This was kind of like all those problems all wrapped into one. Like, there had been no concept of a max capacity on the festival, and there had been no concept that maybe 30,000 people might show up because it was a relatively affordable festival in the heart of Los Angeles. So this was something that you could feel there was probably too many people there. Not like in any kind of like, it was in danger kind of place where it was like beyond fire codes or anything. Like, I don't have any notion of what those numbers were and what, Los Angeles was communicating to the festival. So I'm not saying that. But you could just kind of feel like there was just too many damn people there. It just felt like this was more than this festival had kind of accounted for. And everywhere you looked, all these bizarre problems started kind of propping up. There was like 2-hour-long lines to get a hamburger. There wasn't that much food, and people were having to stand in line for hours to get food. There were numerous instances where bands were complaining from the stage that they were very, very frustrated by what didn't seem to be happening, and there was almost no one to keep anything under control or any security. It really felt like, as a festival, that it was just very sloppily, hastily put together. It felt like fans were confused. It felt like there was some degree of frustration. I remember, having heard a lot about Ariel Pink's Haunted Graffiti and checking it out and being like, wow. And I mean, Ariel Pink was always a bit of a loose cannon in the way that he did his shows and was known to, have little kind of tantrums on stage, and there was all kinds of crazy crap happening in that show that seemed just decidedly unfocused. And Ted Leo was making numerous complaints from the stage during his set. Panda Bear played almost entirely in shadows. It was hard to tell what was even happening. I guess that's not terribly surprising considering Animal Collective and what Animal Collective was known for, and their set designs weren't terribly dissimilar in that respect. But then, coming up on the end of the day, Sleep played. And holy crap. Hearing that record, Holy Mountain, hearing it just front to back in its entirety, and I mean, the three of them are just really good players. I mean, just as far as musicianship is concerned, if I remember correctly, there's very little in the way of vocals or words in that performance, but that is just an undulating sea of a journey of a record. And that was just something of like technical majesty. Seeing that happen, seeing that go down, and being there to witness that, it was just so remarkably special. I'd say like everything else about that day was an inherent disappointment, and was just, wow, I can't believe I'm bothering to do this for 8 hours on a weekend. But seeing Sleep do that record, my God, it was wonderful. And that's one of those things that just is, when there is pure satisfaction, music often can give pure satisfaction. But this is one of those things that you appreciate from a point of like just technical ecstasy. You see what is possible when really gifted people are just going, we don't give a crap. We're going to do what we think is good and what we want music to be. This is how we're working it out. Now, you as a layman, if you didn't know it, you might listen to it and think this sounds like a recorded jam session, but it's really an immaculate composition that has lots of different sections and sequences, and it's just wonderful. So if it's a kind of thing, if you're not familiar with, if you have not listened to it before, I highly recommend checking out their albums. Holy Mountain, or sometimes referred to as Sleep's the Holy Mountain. Sometimes it's cataloged that way. And then, of course, what was known as Jerusalem, what is commonly referred to nowadays as Dope Smoker. Really great records. I know that's a weird thing to hear coming out of my mouth. Say, yes, go get the album that's called Dope Smoker. But I promise you, it's an amazing piece of music. If you're serious about music and you're looking for something really different and exciting, this is the reason why some years back, they made it as far as winning a Grammy. So, we're going to end off there on this, the penultimate episode of This Week is Live for what is loosely going to be called our first season. Wanted to thank everyone here again for joining us in all of the ways and all the capacities that you may, whether you're watching us here on Twitch, whether you see this after the fact. We post these episodes on YouTube the week after. We always air these live between 5:30 and 6:30 p.m. Pacific time on Twitch on Thursdays, and then we package and basically publish everything either Tuesday or Wednesday on YouTube. Whether you watch us on Twitch live or you watch us on YouTube, if you see this any of the places that we post clips from it, whether that's TikTok, whether that's on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram in Reels, or whether that's in YouTube in Shorts, we thank you very much for your support. If you do not already, please like us on Twitch, subscribe to us on YouTube, find us anywhere that you are in social media as at MXDWN. If you're on YouTube, it's at MXDWN Video. We're going to be back next week with one more episode and try here very hard to go out with a bang before we take a couple months off into 2024. So please check back with us next week. This is going to be the last episode for this year until early next year. We're going to take a nice little hiatus from this, kind of reset. We've got a lot of different video initiatives going, and then we're going to be back in 2024. So we'll see you here live on Twitch next Thursday at about 5:30 p.m. Pacific time, somewhere between there and 6:30 p.m. Pacific time. So thanks again for joining us. So glad to see you well.